I don't think the one about the spaceship sprinkling the DMT on people is that plausible, but I mean, who knows? It could be. In the spring of last year, I was interviewed by Whitley Strieber, and we really kind of batted around the whole thing of the similarity and what kind of differences occur between the reports of our volunteers and both Strieber's experience and those of a lot of the people that he's spoken with. And we kind of were thinking of a spectrum of encounters with these beings. At one end of the spectrum is the purely consciousness to consciousness encounter, which just occurs kind of mind to mind or consciousness to consciousness. And at the other end of the spectrum is the purely physical encounter with objects and burn marks and that sort of stuff. But what probably occurs if it is a real phenomena, which one could argue about forever, but if it is a real phenomena, then probably the vast majority of the encounters occur at some point between those two extremes of the poles of pure consciousness to consciousness or physicality to physicality. I think what occurred in our study was probably just what I would think of as the kind of pole of pure consciousness to consciousness encounter. Clearly there was no physical evidence of, being manipulated. There was certainly all the stuff was just occurring in our hospital room. So, there was a complete absolute kind of lack of any physical evidence. But,
were the same people having the alien encounters, or did it have a smattering across the whole group, or?
Well, I'm not sure what your question is.
I guess were the people who saw the aliens in their DMT episodes, were they the same ones consistently, or did the whole group? Well, you said about half. I'm sorry, half.
Yeah, it was around half the group probably. It was curious. There was one study in which I gave DMT a number of times one morning.
Yeah.
A large dose, then a half hour went by, then another large dose, then another half hour. In the space of a few hours, people got 4 injections of DMT. And with a number of those volunteers, the development of the experiences kind of followed a course of closer and closer and more intimate contact with these beings. The stories got more elaborate. The level of interaction and communication became a lot more profound. So from experience to experience, at least within the course of a morning, the same person would just kind of carry on from one trip to the next in terms of the
depth and the unfolding of what happened.
The progression and evolution of a relationship.
Boy, interesting. So they just kept coming back. You would think to the same place.
Yeah, and it would be a continuation. They would kind of build upon the previous experience.
Did you follow up with the volunteers to see if they had UFO experiences or sightings or encounters on their own afterwards? Once introduced, did they keep coming back?
That's an interesting question. No. Well, in terms of your question about, about following up, yeah, I have followed up with a number of the volunteers, but no in terms of whether or not that kind of opened the door for more frequent contact or spontaneous contact.
I have a favorite UFO researcher who says that after he was investigating this phenomenon by following up on reports that would come in, he headed the MUFON for the country of Canada for a while. He said suddenly one day the phenomenon went after him, and all sort of weird things started happening, and he just had to say stop, and it stopped. So it was very interesting. Have you had any such experience where odd things started happening to you outside the context of the experiment?
Well, it was a pretty hard time for me. It was pretty stressful. I was giving a lot of people a lot of DMT, and I was hearing a lot of really unusual stories. People were going through some amazingly positive and kind of negative states
Mm-hmm.
So I was going to a very intuitive body worker at the time, sort of at the tail end of the research, and she kind of stopped and said to me, I'm worried about you. There seem to be these beings that are trying to become corporeal through you and through the research, and I think that it's a bad thing and you ought to stop. So
that would freak me out, yeah.
It was a pretty funny report from her. I kind of laughed and said, oh, don't worry, but,
Did you feel like you were opening a door through the rift of consciousness? And
well, I felt like in a way I'd opened Pandora's box.
Yeah.
I had opened this kind of portal for all of these people to encounter all of these experiences. And I must admit I was expecting a lot of mystical states and a lot of psychological kind of healing, as it were, through these studies, but I think we gave too big a dose of DMT. I think we just blew people right off course, and they ended up in these really unexpected, unusual realms. And I wasn't expecting them. I wasn't expecting these contact stories, and I was having a hard time explaining them to the volunteers and to explaining them to myself. Like, what am I doing, and what is going on here? It's kind of like, who's in charge of this work anyway?
Did you lower the dose over time?
Well, we didn't lower the dose, but the studies became a little more complicated. They became a lot more pharmacologically oriented and not quite as psychologically oriented. So I was trying to modify the effects of DMT with other drugs, like to block its effects or to modify its effects. So the doses ended up not being quite as high as a result of the combination.
Of the blocking ingredients? What do you find that blocks, besides Thorazine? Are there substances that people are ingesting on a regular basis that would tend to counteract the natural ingestion of the DMT, to be counteractive to it?
Well, in our studies, I was pre-treating people just a few hours before the injection of DMT. To determine if we could block the effects, or I guess even more accurately is, to blunt the effects. And we briefly studied a narcotic blocking drug. It's called naltrexone. And it made people pretty uncomfortable just all by itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it was hard to get the volunteers to get into that study. We also were treating people with a specific antihistamine, which also is a blockader of serotonin. And the volunteers really got sleepy and dopey on that drug. It was hard, to get those people, to take that drug as well. So we were kind of starting those studies, but they were hard to tease apart what were the effects of the medication alone versus what were its effects on blocking DMT. Also, it was hard to recruit volunteers for those studies. Nobody was that keen on getting in a DMT study that kind of reduced the effects. So it was around that time that the studies became not quite as much fun to do. People were not quite as enthusiastic about volunteering.
Mm-hmm.
Adverse effects started to just seem a little clearer to me, and also I wasn't really getting that impressed with any long-term benefits from people's big experiences on DMT. So there were a number of factors that kind of got me to start slowing down the research and ultimately stopped doing it around the end of 1995 or so.
So many of spiritual traditions say that one's intent going into a meditation, a prayer, a ceremony, whatever, is the key. And I have found, too, that say a prayer before you're meditating, I have a much better meditation, a much more mystical one. Did anybody add some of those elements? I intend to, commune with our Creator as opposed to an alien. Were people able to direct the nature of their experience at all through their intent or...
Well, for the first few minutes, it was really quite impossible to direct anything. All one could do was hold on. But a lot of people kind of went into it, either chanting or praying or meditating